Good evening, everybody. Tonight we are going to be beginning our work in Unit 4. Unit 4 will cover chapters 5 and 6. And you can see the topic for these two chapters is a technology called Active Record. And Active Record is, the way I like to think about it, it is basically our database interface for Ruby on Rails. Really, the correct way to think about it is Active Record is what we would call a database abstraction layer, meaning that instead of like with many languages where we write SQL code and intersperse it with our regular code, in this case there's a special syntax that we use to interface with our database. There's a certain collection of tools that we're going to be using, some of which, or I should say most of which we've already been introduced to. For those of you maybe jumping into this cold, if you're just grabbing the video online, we are going to be working with a database tool that I like to use, a graphical front end for the SQLite 3 database that's included in our development setup. And that tool is called SQLite Browser. And the truth is there's other ways to interface with SQLite databases, but I find that is a free tool that works great and it does all the things that we need it to do. And I'm pretty sure that the book points that out pretty early on in the chapter. So I'm going to jump over to the text, and actually I have it open in both my browser and Adobe Acrobat here, so I always prefer to use Acrobat when I'm working. All right, so to give you a little bit of a background here on what we're going to be doing in this chapter. And for those of you that have done database work in the past, and that should be all of you, you should have had, at the very least, before you get to this class, you should have had your advanced databases class or the database class, whether in the software dev program or the web program. And you probably have done database connectivity with several languages at this point. You should have worked with PHP and MySQL, and that's a classic combination. In fact, that's really the old school traditional approach of open source web work. PHP being the server-side language, and then MySQL being the database that runs on the server. And a lot of projects that run on PHP connect to MySQL as the database. In fact, a lot of content management systems, especially open source content management systems such as WordPress and Drupal and Joomla, and I could go on, but those are kind of like the big three, all use that technology. Believe it or not, one of the world's largest websites, or at least originally, was built upon PHP and MySQL. Want to wager as to what that is? Facebook? For all I know, Google uses it too. I really don't know what their back end is with Google anymore, but Facebook was originally built by a college student, and I want you guys to keep that in mind. They just basically built a PHP MySQL website, right? So really pretty simple technologies that just got ramped up. What they're actually running now, who's to know? Really, we don't get a peek into that code. And the problem with a lot of these server-side technologies, and I want you guys to keep this in mind, is that once it hits your browser and you do a right-click and view source, you don't see the code that created that website. You see the result of the code, right? And that's true with all server-side technologies. There are clues that you can look for that will give you a hint as to what technology was used if you know what to look for. So like if you've worked with WordPress, for example, you do a right-click view source, you might quickly see some of the directories that are associated with WordPress. And you know what? The truth is you can see those same clues in the structure of Ruby on Rails applications too, especially when they get more complex and have a significant number of external file calls. That's usually where you see the trace of it. In terms of actually looking at the source code in the browser and seeing Ruby code or any of the stuff we're going to learn in this chapter, absolutely not. You're just going to see the resulting action of that code. If you will, the view that's generated by the code, what the author wants us to see. All right. Now, I mentioned before that really Active Record is what we call a database abstraction layer. So we're going to be issuing commands in this environment that will be intercepted by the engine of Ruby on Rails, and then those will be converted to the commands that we need to interface with the database. The goal of that really is to keep our interactions clean and not really have to be mired in learning another language. Does it help to know SQL before you do this stuff? Without a doubt. I mean, because if you don't really understand how databases work and all the stuff that we're doing in this chapter, it won't click as much as if you actually do. So you can actually learn these technologies without being a database guru. Same is true with PHP. Because the truth is, for most web developers, once you have your database created and the 4, 5, 10, 20 tables that you might happen to use, usually you're just reading and writing data and updating information. You're not really manipulating the database or writing stored procedures at that point. That's really work that's done on a different development level. For web people, the database is really the warehouse of information that drives the site. Okay. One other technology that they're mentioning in here is this thing called object relational mapping, and that's one of the core technologies for database design. And a lot of databases use that technology in order to do an interface. So for example, if you learn Visual Basic and you learn this link queue syntax, and I know we're learning it in a little bit in ASP.NET 2, and chances are if you've ever done any stuff with Visual Basic or C#, if you're in the software development program, that will be something that's pretty useful as well. In ASP.NET 2, the tool that we use is the thing called Entity Framework, which actually creates that interface layer for us. And here we're using a technology called Active Record to essentially do the same thing. All right, so notice some of the highlights that I've put forth in this chapter, and I do that to just draw your attention to them, and also so I don't forget to talk about them. It's kind of like a double-edged thing. You know, I opt not to make PowerPoints for this stuff because really all of our instructions come straight from the book. So I'm just kind of using the book really in that capacity. And notice the first highlight I have here says a key feature of Active Record is that it maps tables to classes, table rows to objects, and table columns to object attributes. I want you to think about those words really carefully because it's easy to just read that and gloss over it. So real carefully, once again, is that a table in Active Record will be represented by a class. So we will have a class file that actually represents the structure of the table. And then when we start adding actual records to that table, those rows will be considered objects. So each entry in the database table really you should think about it as each row is equivalent to a particular entity. So if you're thinking like of an address database, right, that pertains to, let's say, your address, right? That address belongs to one entity, right? So in that case, it becomes an object. And then because we are dealing with these entries or rows in the table, and then each one has columns, each one of those columns then becomes an attribute. And if you think about it in terms of how classes are structured, we build classes where we have data fields. Those are the attributes that make each one of the instantiations unique. And every time you instantiate, you're really instantiating a row of the table. So hopefully that and thus the object. One of the things that's kind of interesting here, and I know that we've looked at a little bit of this syntax, is whenever you see that little symbol there, keep in mind that that refers to extends. So when we are working with a particular class, so we're building a data model here, right, for all intents and purposes connecting it to the database, it extends all the class attributes of Active Record. So Active Record is really kind of like the base class or the super class, depending on the terminology you want to use, where we're pulling in all the features to be able to do all the interactions. Okay. The two dots basically indicate that you're pulling in also from there a base class. So it's kind of like, Robert, a good way to think of that is like another layer of superclass, basically. So in other words, we have a language base that we're pulling from. Active record pulls from that language base. And then our class that we create called book is also pulling from active record. One thing that you guys will see is as we start to create stuff is sometimes this type of syntax adjusts a little bit over time. So this particular syntax I think has remained unchanged, but there's a couple of things that that change. So notice that I have this highlighted here too, so if you want to actually read it. It says, notice the part that reads bracket active record, colon, colon, base. The less than sign indicates the book class on the left is a subclass of the one on the right. Now notice that this one also includes the colon, so that is kind of designating itself as being the base class to the book that we're creating. I hope that that gives some clarity, but if not, I think usage will help you. A good example of this is if like you think back to doing like maybe GUI programming in Java, and when you started doing your GUI programming, all of a sudden every application we would write, as long as it was window based, we'd write extends application, and then application would then serve as the base class or the super class to whatever we were creating. But that class in and of itself is also pulling from other libraries based in the standard Java libraries for the whole language. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is as we're working with tables and objects and classes is this notion of plurality and how we can be referring to something in a singular and also refer to it in a plural. So notice the class declaration here with a capital B is in singular. And notice down here as we instantiate that we're also referring to it in the singular. And there will be times when we will be working with the plural, and that will be situationally dependent on what we're doing. All right, so why don't we go ahead and do the first thing here. Now notice that this is really easy to miss, okay? So it says right here, you just need to create a Ruby class that's named after a table you want to map and extend the record base class. So what they're doing here is this is an example, folks. So this is not something that I think that we're actively going to type in at this point, but I just want you to look at the syntax first. So assuming that we create a class with active record, there is an implication here that when we create that class, that it directly relates to a table in the database, right? So remember the first thing I said, the class equates to the table. When we go through the process without even knowing what the column names are, I can extrapolate some of them from the next little bit of code without really knowing much about it. So for example, they start out with a statement that says book, which is just a variable name, mind you. And on the right side of the equal sign, we are instantiating a copy of book. And what we're doing here as we create this object is we're creating a row in the table. That's kind of deep, really, you know? So we say book.new. So it is basically creating a new record in the table. And then clearly title, publisher, and published at are all columns within that table. All of them seem to either take strings or date time. And then notice the final command, book.save. So there's another implication here that while we are feeding information into this new row, it does not automatically save to the table until we tell it to save to the table. Now, for those of you that have worked with databases before, you should realize that if you are in a tool, and you can think of SQL Server, and you can think of like MySQL Workbench, or Access even for that matter, or the SQLite browser that we're using in this class, many times when you write information into the table in graphical view, like you have rows and columns like a spreadsheet, that record is not written for most databases until you move out of that column. The SQLite browser actually won't write any of the changes until you click the little button that says Write Changes. And that's a pretty common technique. So basically what happens is we kind of instantiate the object in memory first, we give it all of its attributes, and then we say, okay, time to write it to the table. That's the principle here that we're following. All right. At this point, the author does go ahead and point us to SQLite.org. And we've already gone through this process earlier where we got SQLite installed. We've already had the browser up and running, the SQLite browser, so we could take a look at our databases. But there is information here if you want to go to their website or if you want to read up on it. I think it's pretty interesting. The other tool that they're pointing out is this tool for Active Record called Data Mapper. And, frankly, I'm not a huge fan of the tool, but I know there's a lot of people that do use it, and they do mention it here for good reason. But there are things that you can do with this tool that you cannot do with SQLite. And I don't know if you've noticed with SQLite, but it's a lightweight database tool. The thinking really is that people doing websites aren't really doing very fancy procedures in their database. They're just storing information. And that typically is the case. All right, so here's the question. What about SQL? Well, you guys have learned this, right? And, and I always have that little talk, is it SQL or is it SQL? The answer is kind of both, depending on what world you come from. If you talk to old school people, they'll say it's SQL because it really stands for Structured Query Language, and it was really kind of the end of the 20th century and going into the 21st century that I started hearing people say SQL. So they're kind of used interchangeably. Notice all the highlight that I have in that chapter, and this is kind of interesting about SQL as a language, or SQL as a language. It is not object-oriented. Isn't that weird, right? But you know what? Does it need to be? And when they created it, they didn't really have the concept of what objects really were in terms of programming or the implication of those objects. But really, when you start dealing with the database structure, you have object-like structure already present. We talked about how a table can be a class, and a row can be an object, and the columns can be attributes. In fact, those are really good little pieces of information you might want to stick in the back of your head for that upcoming exam. Just a slight hint that might be on there. Now, I do want you to also notice that they do have an appendix in the book at the back that does give you kind of like an overview of SQL. So if you haven't done it in a while, or you really kind of just want to pick it up really quick and get the basic ideas, there is a guide back there. It is kind of simplistic, but it covers enough to make you dangerous. We have no need in this class to get to the level of doing, for example, stored procedures or something like that. We're not hitting that kind of level. We're going to stay, probably about as far as we're going to go is maybe like a foreign key. That's about it. And you guys should hopefully understand what that actually means. All right. There are certain patterns that they do like to point out here. So if you want, I would suggest to you that you read this first little blurb here. I think it's kind of interesting because it talks about this guy named Martin Fowler. And what this guy did, and you look back at the date there, I mean, it was just after the 21st century started that he started to kind of map this out in his head and kind of see that there's a pattern that happens where we can take a basic database structure and relate it to an object-oriented structure. And now many programming languages use this type of approach in order to deal with the data in a database. So they take the database table or tables, if they're connected together, and then they pull the data out and instantiate the data as an object within an application that is its own unique entity. So I like that description of how they call that. So it's really a good one to use as kind of like a guide. Notice the next highlight I have here. It says active record lets you model real world things in your code. Rails calls these real world things models, or the M in MVC. And this is really one of the key tenets, folks, of this whole architecture. Because Ruby on Rails, by design, it's really the only way that you use this tool is to use an MVC structure. And if you guys remember back to the beginning, the views, I mean, that's a pretty easy part, right? That's what we see on the screen. And then you guys have also been figuring out controllers, where controllers kind of like direct traffic, run logic, maybe connect to data, maybe not. Maybe they just push you right back to a view. And then really what they do is they receive the URL from the browser and manipulate or use that and do something with it. But the M really does rely on the fact that we are dealing with data. Whether or not we're tying to a database or not, almost always we do, but sometimes we don't. But what is it we do with that data? Are we just pulling the data out of the database and then using it to do something and it goes away? Yeah, a lot of times that's what we do. We don't necessarily change that data, and a lot of times we don't actually add data to the database either. So the model, a really good way to think of the model is it's a representation of the data in object form. It might persist, it might not persist. It really kind of all depends on your design. Now, the other thing that's kind of interesting here, and I want to kind of read this to you because I think that it's helpful. So notice that it says a model might be named person, product, or article. Notice carefully the capital letter to start it. So there's a convention, like as with Java and C#, where we typically start our class names with capital letters. Notice also that those classes or those models are in the singular. Notice that when we actually go through the process of instantiating something into an object, all of a sudden we go to the plural form of the same word. And yes, if you call a class in Ruby person, when you instantiate, you have people, because people is the plural of person. And it does that automatically, believe it or not. The plurality of certain words is built into the language. So if I say product, notice that it becomes products, lowercase p with an S at the end, or article and articles. And we're going to see a lot of that one because that's the one that we're going to mess with the most, right? But that first one's really weird, right? Because you say, okay, so I have a person, table or class, and then when I put people into it, see how it works? Right, but see what it indicates, right? Because like if you create an article database table, every time you enter an article, you have articles. So that's kind of the logic there. It is a little bit weird, right? Most languages do not do this. It's kind of a quirk. All right. So the thinking is really that that part of the abstraction layer really kind of saves you from writing a lot of like goofy, unnecessary code to make things work. So there's the highlights that go with it. Class names are singular. Table names are plural. Okay. Okay, that sounds a little opposite of what I just said, but if you think about the class names, build the table. And then every time you add the entity, it adds additional records. Tables contain an identity column named ID. So regardless of what you create, and this is really good database design, and all good database products usually enforce the creation of an ID column, even if in our mind it's never used. Okay, so I want you to think about that. But it's really just considered good database design, that you always have some sort of an ID column, because that way it allows you to get things in proper spots. Okay. All right, now take a look at how the table and class names uh, combine with each other. So if I create a class called event, the table name then will be called events, that the class name of person is people, and category is categories, IES, notice. And that if I give a class name of order item, and notice that's a weird one too, where it's kind of like a camel case kind of thing. Each logical word is a capital letter with no punctuation or anything in between, but the table name will insert an underscore and keep it all lowercase. There is actually a whole concept that goes behind this, and it's all abstracted based on the fact that you're creating your class first. Okay, you're creating the structure for your data, and you're implying it in a class file. Keep that in mind as well. Now, we've been working a lot with the command prompt so far, and I'd like to tell you that we're going to add another prompt in a sense. All right, so we've been working with the C prompt, or if you have if you're working with the bash prompt, which is the $, or if you're on a Mac or Linux machine, you get the $, prompt. Really kind of all the same thing, because when you're working with these languages, it doesn't matter which system you're on, the commands are all the same. Okay, so that's one thing. The other thing that we learned is that there's certain commands that are particular to specific languages. So for example, if I want to do something in Ruby, sometimes I have to call the Ruby command in order to be Ruby command first, and then the action. It's almost like building a sentence. It's kind of like how the Linux command prompt works, very much the same way. The other thing you'll notice is that you have stuff that you do with Rails. Same thing. You'll have a Rails command and then kind of build a sentence, with like verbs and actions and stuff. We also saw that there's an interactive Ruby prompt, and that's a different prompt that allows you to type Ruby commands directly to that environment. So that will kind of be our tool here, but there's also really another level of prompt as well that hopefully you don't have to use, and that is a direct SQL prompt, right? So the SQLite tool also has a prompt that you can use, but we're going to prefer to actually use the graphical tool for the simple things that we're going to do. That's just my preference. If you want to use the prompt, go for it. All right. So let's go ahead and try this Rails console, which is a different tool altogether. Now, you have to keep in mind, Ruby is our programming language. Rails is a development framework, right? Ruby's got its interactive Ruby prompt, or you can run things from the C prompt. Rails has a bunch of things you can do from a regular prompt, including running rake commands and things like that. But Rails has a console all its own that's going to allow us to work with all the database abstraction stuff, and you have to trigger this command in order to get into it. So let's go ahead and actually type that command in. I preemptively, in my command prompt, navigated from my user directory to the root of the C drive, and then into my projects folder for blog. Okay, that's where I'm working from. Now, will all the stuff necessarily go directly to the application? I'm just kind of making that assumption, right? So let's go with it. And you can probably guess that I've done this enough times where I know that we should be. So at the prompt, go ahead and please type Rails console and get the the double bracket prompt up on your screen. So we type Rails console. It'll just take a moment to come up. All right. Now you notice that the prompt that appears is what, folks? Not the double bracket prompt that you were expecting to see, correct? Notice that really what we're working with is Ruby. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's still the Ruby prompt, even though we say Rails console. So remember, Rails is a framework that sits on top of Ruby. Okay, but this is, excuse me, something that's important to point out, because there was a time when we did this, and we did get the double bracket prompt, and a lot of people didn't realize that you could run Ruby commands here. Or maybe they would realize that the Ruby commands would run it, or wondering why the command looks different. And that's something that's changed from the printing of the book to now we're working on Rails 5 and the book is Rails 4. All right. All right, so now we're gonna try out some of these commands, and notice that the first one that they want us to type is article dot column underscore names, spelled correctly, and it looks like I clicked off of that screen or something. I'm trying to backspace. It's not letting me backspace. All right, so I'm going to actually press enter here and hope to get out. Okay, so I'm going to have to go back in, folks. So sometimes that'll happen when you're running that prompt. All right, so now I have a new session. And let's try typing that again, but correctly this time. And I'm really curious as to, I clicked off the screen and came back, and I kind of lost the ability to backspace, which is kind of a strange effect. All right, so what I'm going to type now is just a very simple command, but notice that article is going to refer to one of the tables that we already have. So, and then dot column names, I mean, you can guess what that does without too much effort. And you'll see a response similar to what the book has, or exactly like what the book has, which is basically in square brackets a series of strings that indicate all the column names. So really what that's telling you is that column names is an array that holds those values. Next thing that we should type is just article. So now this is kind of interesting. We're not typing what the column names are. We're just saying article. And then we're going to get a different type of output. Look at the prompt that comes back. So we got that equal sign bracket. And then it shows article. And then what does it do to go with it? Not values, but data types. So what this is indicating to us is that one is the column name and the other one is the data type. Now, Ruby might not care about what data type you put in a variable, but I can tell you what does care a whole lot. Can you think of a structure, information-wise that like SQL or a database, basically, that isn't strongly data typed? Databases must be strongly typed. You don't really have a choice in a database because otherwise your applications fail. In fact, one of the top things that can make an application fail is the fact that we're not getting the data correctly to the database. So the reason that we have a command like this is this gives us back all the data types of what's actually going in. And then the thing that I think is interesting here, okay, ID is an integer, I guess that makes sense, right? Because it's just a number. Title is a string, that makes sense. But then notice that now we're using database terminology here, folks, right? So the body is text, and then if you're thinking of like SQL, what would be the equivalent to that? What would you say in a SQL database for text? Would you say string? Well, here's my testing you on databases. What would you use in a MySQL or a SQL Server database to put text in? Ooh, varchar, right? VARCHAR, and then you usually designate how long that VARCHAR, right? That's one of the data types. Then we also have published at datetime, created at datetime, updated at same, an excerpt, which is a string, and location, which is a string. So the implication here is that a string is short and that text is long. And if you're working with regular databases, it will, use that other terminology. All right, let's try the next command, which is article.methods.size. And then what this simply does is it tells you how many methods are available to the article class, meaning how many methods are built in to active record as a superclass that we can pull in, right? Notice how the book says 549, because version 4, that's what they had. Now we're on version 5, and yes, they've added, nearly 100 more methods. And Lord knows what they do. They probably fix our code for us at this point, I'm guessing. All right. Next little section we're going to jump into here is this little, what they're calling a crash course in Ruby class design. So what we're going to start to do is learn how these classes actually work. All right, let's take a look at an example here. And if you want, I'm going to tell you what, you could actually type this code in if you want. You want to try it? Have you done it? Yeah, you can if you'd like. But yes, you can declare a class for a car. All right, so that's the first step. And notice we're not adding anything to it. We're just saying class car. So the point of this really is to show you how classes work in this language. Now, we got a little bit of this last chapter, but this is kind of like a refresh. And then we're going to create two instances, okay? One's called car1, one's called car2, and you can say car new. So you know what? Should I go ahead and try this? Sure. What's going to happen? What's the worst thing that's going to happen? It doesn't work right. That's the worst thing that's going to happen. So we're going to do class car and okay, and then I can say car1 equals car.new, and then we're going to say car2 equals car.new. Now, the thing that's, I think, fascinating about this, if you want to think of the functional equivalent in some other language, if I had a class called car in Java, that's a good example, right? If I wanted to create, and I'll type it in at the prompt here. In Java, if I wanted to create a new car, I'd have to say car1 equals new car, and then probably parentheses and whatever, right? Yeah. So that's really kind of the functional equivalent here. It's just a modern, cleaner syntax. And you know what? Right. We don't have to declare the class before we do it. Right. So Java also does have ways where you can instantiate things on the fly. And I don't know if you guys do this much. You don't have to name an object. Sometimes you just, sometimes you just say new car. you know, in Java. You know, you can do that in Java, right? All right. So this is kind of like somewhere in between because we are naming it and it's storing it. All right. And then if you want, you can go in there. Yeah, and see, this is where it gets a little bit more complicated because now you got to type all this code in, and really anywhere that there's a comment, you can actually omit it. But notice what we're doing. It says class car, and then notice what we're really doing is getters and setters if you're reading the paragraph. But here, notice what they're calling them. Reader and writer. Well, if we're instantiating something, we probably want to make it unique. So reading the information from it, but writing something to it. So getters and setters, or if you want to think of it as reader and writer methods. Now, I prefer the getters and setters to call it that, frankly, because that's what everybody else calls them. So rather than use different terminology, but if you ever hear like some Ruby on Rails guru say readers and writers, they're probably testing you, to see if you're paying attention, because anybody that really knows Ruby would probably know that. Okay, so I'm just kind of giving you guys some lingo to work with. But I think most coders still think of it as getters and setters. So you get the information and you set the information. So with here, notice how this works. So when we say make, wait a second, what does that refer? Well, like the make and model of a car. That's really what they're referring to here. So in this case, notice it says make equals in parentheses text. So this one is obviously which? The getter. No, I fooled you. It's the setter, right? So notice how they say it's the writer. It's the one that sets the value. So it's going to receive text from the user as a parameter, and it's going to take that text and store it. And then notice the @ sign at the beginning. Yeah, it's instantiating it as an object. It's making it part of the object. So, and then of course the reader or the getter just retrieves the information, just pulls it in. That's all it does, from whatever the current instance is. If you want to go ahead and keep typing these in, I guess I've already kind of given up on doing it, so because that's not really the important thing here. But if you want to go ahead and try this, please feel free to type it in. No harm done. Okay, so fine, I'll copy paste it in. I know you guys are teasing me now, but yes, the beautiful thing is I can. So, and notice the resulting action after I press enter is what? Make. And what does that colon in front of it mean? It's a symbol, which is kind of like the equivalent of kind of like a variable, right? It's a temporary value that's holding something a whole lot more, right, than what you might think. It's still based on the class of car, so we kind of like expanded the car class here in memory, and then it created methods in there that are a symbol, and the reason it becomes a symbol is because we're storing an object in it, basically. All right, so if you want to like try the next thing now, we can go my car, just a variable name, equals car dot new. Okay, then you get this kind of weird cryptic output. Okay, it basically is, it is a memory location is really what you're looking at. Basically, we created a spot in memory for it, but we didn't put anything in the object, so there's nothing there to store. All right, if you look at the next command, the command is my car dot make, right? Which, and of course, right, and it's going to come back nil because we haven't set that value. I mean, it's really what that's all about. Now, if I say my car dot make, and then put an equal sign in there where we can do the assignment. Now I can say Toyota, and in my case, it's almost always, yes, I'm part of the cult. Part of the cult of Volkswagen. Although I own a Toyota also, so no judgment. But, okay, so it's just grabbing it as a string. Now that is part of the object, right? So you're getting that concept in it. All right. Now, of course, if you type mycar.make, and yes, you can. My mouse. All right, continuing on with the example, of course, we show that we can set it, we can read it, right? Or if you want to think writer, reader, instead of getter and setter, or setter and getter, if you're using that approach. And of course, you can change it to something else if you want on the same variable name. I don't know, let's think of something like this, right, Nathan? Which relates to our web project management class. All right, and of course, if I pull the make back now, you can see that it's changed. And this is pretty simple stuff, okay? But it shows that that class we created with the make methods inside of it really are there to get and set attributes for a particular field. Right. Very, very simple example, but I think it does demonstrate how the technology works. Okay. It's also kind of neat that we can just do it all from the prompt and not actually have to go and like create a text file. Always remember though, the moment I go ahead and close this prompt, it's all gone. Memory is wiped. Hypothetically at least. Okay. Right. If we are working in a real application, we might abstract some of those things and actually store them in the database. Okay. That's where we get, but we're showing you how the class works first and how you can do getters and setters, and then we're going to build up to interacting with the database. All right, let's talk about this concept of CRUD. CRUD stands for, okay, I had a create, read, update, delete. I usually do create, retrieve, update, destroy. Right? I like to make it a little more colorful. But yeah, those are basically your basic database operations. So create is inserting a new record. Retrieving is just simply, selecting the record and pulling it back. Update, of course, is update. That's what they call it in SQL. And then destroy or delete removes the record. Okay. But those are really considered the basic operations. And one thing that you guys have already discovered from the real simplistic little blog stuff that we did is this architecture, once you have stuff tied to a database table, will automatically generate the tools that you need to create those interactions very automatically and very powerfully with a minimal amount of code, which I think is very useful. All right, now we're going to jump to the example that's listed here, and we're kind of abandoning the car example. Do I have to close my prompt or anything like that? Nope, not at all. Those stuff still exists in memory at the prompt. They're not part of our database. We know that already, right? We are recognizing the fact, though, that just because we're in this directory, that it is reading the database associated with the blog application that we created. If I was in a different folder, in my projects folder, with a different project name, I would be looking at the information in a different database. It's all based upon the directory that you're currently in. And that's kind of a unique thing. All right, now we're going to move on to this, demonstrating the constructor one more time, although we just did it with the car. But now we're going to create the article, all lowercase and singular, based upon the article class I'm having a hard time getting the I before the C there. And we're just going to say article.new. Go ahead and press enter. Of course, you will get a response that says nil, right? Because we're not putting anything in, we're just instantiating. I do want you to notice the difference in the output here, though. Notice that the way this is coming, actually this one's not too bad. This one looks identical actually to what's in the book, but there are a couple as we move on that you're going to notice a difference in output, and this is not one of them, and I apologize for making you think that perhaps it was. But notice that it indicates, once again, with this new object that we created, it acknowledges the fact that we created it, and it acknowledges the fact that all the fields are empty. However, there is an empty row in the database now, and we need to provide values for each one of these things. But first, let's try this command. So we just basically placed a new object inside this variable called article. And notice this really curious little method that they have called new underscore record question mark. It's just part of the method name. But, the question mark doesn't do anything magical. It's just part of a string of text, but it doesn't indicate what you're asking, right? Is article a new record? Oh, of course it is, because it's empty. And not only that, but it has an empty ID field, which is, usually considered not good. All right. The other thing that we can do is we can type this other command that you might find useful in certain situations, especially if you're working from a prompt like this and you're just trying to extract what information is available. So I'm going to take that article that as in its variable name form and ask about its attributes. So I'm just saying article attributes, and then it, like we saw above, but notice this time it's inside of curly brackets, once again in a key value pair setup in the form of a hash, column name, and the value currently stored. So right now it's nil, okay, for all of those, which we should expect. Let's go ahead and give that article a title. So in this case, they want us to call it Rails Conf. So they're using a lot of like Linux-like syntax here. What does conf stand for? C-O-N-F. Conference? Not quite. Typically when we use that four-letter thing in a Linux environment, we're talking about configuration files, right? But you know what, Robert, you're actually right, because if you look below, they actually are referring to a conference, so it's kind of a trick question. So if you press enter on that one, it shows that it is stored, right? Then we can go ahead and we can actually add some other attributes. So we can say article.body, and now we can type in a whole string of text here. I'm just going to copy what they have in the book. I'm going to say Rails Conf is the official gathering for Rails developers, ... You can type a whole bunch more if you want. One thing I will caution you, though, is if you're going to copy and paste from the book and that text goes onto a second line, you want to buffer it into like some sort of a text editor first, just fair warning. All the prompt does is spit back the information that we just typed in, but now we set the title and we put some stuff into the body. You want to type a whole lot more in there, that's fine too. Let's go ahead and also manually create the article published at date, and in this case we're going to say probably today's date. Like so. And you guys are noticing that I'm typing all this stuff in just like the book. I'm using single quotes around most things. Could I use double quotes? You sure could. All right, next thing that they want us to do, and we are now at the top of page 69, is just to type article. And that's just going to pull back the object that's in memory. And notice the ID is still nil, the title is set, the body is set, and the published at date is set. Notice that the published at date also includes a time, which at this point is just 00, so midnight, basically. Right here, you see that? All zeros. Right, so that just goes with date time, whether you add it or not. Now, we're going to save it to the database. And before we save it to the database, I want you to do this. I want you to bring up your SQLite browser. Yeah, one L. I always do that. Yeah, I always want to put in two. And I want to open a database. And remember, the way that you open a database in the SQLite browser is just to navigate to your project directory. And actually the database directory. Right. And I am pulling up the development database because that's the one we're actively working on right now. If you're going to then go ahead and click on Browse Data, and then make sure that you select the Articles table. And I want you to notice that the work that we've done so far is not listed here. That's by, yeah, right, exactly, because that's the next step. So you were reading ahead, which is good. Right, but the reason I did it in that order is I do want to show you that it's not there, and then by just typing article save, I want you to look at the result of the prompt. All right, so I type in article save, and it says, yeah, and then what does it do? And it writes the SQL for you. Don't you love it? Yep. And as long as you don't get an error message or a false here, you're good. Now you should come back and hit the little refresh button in the SQLite browser, and there's the stuff you just entered. Isn't that cool? Yeah, and we did it all from the prompt. Now, granted, if somebody's running your web application, they're not at the prompt typing in console commands, but your code can do it, right? So why would you instantiate something like that? Because you could write code that would receive information from a form, right? Which Ruby on Rails does automatically anyhow. But you could write your own form, grab that data, and then take each piece of data, store it in a variable, feed that variable into a generic structure inside of a class file, issue the article save command, and then it will write to your database from your application. That's really kind of the thinking here. You could. Yes, there are ways to roll it back, but let's not go there quite yet, okay? All right, folks, let's take a break, and we'll come back in a few minutes. Okay, now that we're back from break, I'm bringing the book back up on the screen here to bring up our next command. So we visually went to the database and saw the fact that the information did make it there. So now our objective is to run some of the other commands. And now notice I'm going to type article with a capital A, which is now referring to the class, right, which is tied to the data model, which is tied to the table, right? And now we're going to do an article.count. Now, the book says 1, but mine says 2, right? Which is correct because when we worked in the previous chapters, we had already had an article there. So you're not doing anything wrong if yours says 2 because, just take a look. The database itself does actually have 2 entries. Okay, so Absolutely correct. Yeah, so I'm not sure why that would be the case, that they ignore what we did in the previous chapter, but that's what it is. If we do run that command that we did before, which was the article.new_record ? And this time it will say false because now there's information in there. Okay, so that's just a simple Boolean result. Let's go ahead and create another new article now. So we're bottom of page 69. And this time, notice that this is kind of weird, okay? And maybe you guys might want to stop me right here. It's like, okay, so why are you instantiating a new article with the same variable name? Okay, and the answer for that is because when we write our application, that's what our application is going to do. And we're not going to create a new variable for it each time. Every time we create a new article, we temporarily hold it in memory in the form of a variable, write our changes. That's exactly correct. So we're just holding the Nathan, you hit it on the head. We're holding the transaction in memory until we commit it. Once we commit it, we can just reuse that variable again. There's no reason to redo it. That's exactly how our operation will work. That's why we can write one code file to do this operation. See? So we are going to say article.new. Now, did you guys get an error message here?
I did not.
You did not.
I did article equals article.
Oh, yeah. See, and I did article.new. Yeah. So don't ever question the teacher unless he's making a mistake. In which case, let me know so I don't make one on the video. All right, but I fixed it. Remember, it's code. We're not hurting anybody yet. As soon as we start snooping into their privacy, I guess then we're hurting them. But for right now, we're creating a new article, and it's blank, as we would anticipate. And let's put in an article title. And this one's going to be, looks like, now notice he's using double quotes now. Introduction to SQL. That's his way of saying, or her way of saying that, yeah, you can do that. Then we need some text for the body, in which case SQL stands for if I could only type, then we'd have something going. And I'm putting in ... And then we're going to also do article date today, which we saw early on. And notice when you do that, the different format of the date. And then, of course, let's do our save. You see it says it committed the transaction. I don't believe it. I'm going to come back and look, and sure enough, there it is. And I'm glad you guys find this exciting, because it is kind of exciting. Only geeks find this stuff exciting, in which case you came to the right place. Right? This is like geek university or college. All right, I'm going to show you a different way to do this now, and you can see there's a truncated approach that we can use. And I just, fair warning, for many of the things that we do here, there are ways to do things in multiple fashions. So the next approach is probably an approach that looks a little bit more like what you might do in Java or any other language, where you're not only instantiating the object by doing this, but also passing it the parameters it needs to create something, right? Like you would do in Java. So, for example, here we're going to use the symbol for title. Then notice the equal brackets, kind of like a pointer. And then we're going to go ahead and put in as a string at the prompt, inside double quotes, this is our title, separated by commas. Now I'm going to put in the symbol for body, and we'll actually say a couple of things that might be interesting. Another comma, and then a symbol for published at, and then we're just going to do date.today since that one's so easy to do. Close the parens and press enter. And then I want you to notice that it did grab all those things, but then it also indicated to which fields are still nil. And then, of course, article.save if it's committed to the database. Go back to the database, do a refresh, and sure enough, it's there. So you can see that we're like getting into like the groove now of creating new article titles with body text, right? And then notice how created at and updated at, those are automatically generated fields. Of course, we don't have anything for excerpt or location now, but we're not really concerned about that because they're not asking us to do it. Perhaps. You can read ahead just as well as I can. So, all right, now we're going to move on to the next method here that's critical. And notice that so far we've been doing article.new, which instantiates in memory, right? And then we are feeding in the attributes, right? And then we hit article.save, and then it writes it to the database. But what if you could do that more efficiently? So what if we, instead of calling the variable version of article and putting a new object inside of it, what if we directly address the class? So that's what we're doing here. We're using article with a capital A, and we're using the method called create, and then inside parens, the same thing that we were just doing, giving it values. I'm using this year's date though, hope that's all right. Same exact approach, we're still using symbols, so the syntax here is not different. And then you can say the annual conference, yada, yada, yada. Put in a comma there, and then we're going to do published at. And here they're hard coding a date again, so you know what? I'll follow suit. Close your parentheses, press enter. And folks, if you don't believe that it's stuck, it's, and you know, initially it's not a bad thing to do just to make sure that everything is actually working as you think it's working. All right, let's jump back over to our prompt into our book. Okay, so instead of temporarily storing and then writing, this method directly writes to the database. We are not using a variable in between. We're just doing it. All right. All right. Next thing that you can do, next example, is instead of maybe writing the code the way that we just did, and you see it's truncated off the screen here, so instead of doing this approach where we run the create method, another approach would be to actually feed all that data into a variable. So in this case, attributes is a variable name, and then in the form of a hash, and the reason I call it a hash is now we're inside of curly brackets, all right, but we're still using a symbol. So we're going to do title with our pointer to Rails pub night. I'm sure that's a hoot. Bunch of Ruby on Rails programmers actually hanging out. I'm sure that's, yeah, I'm sure those jokes are funny. I'm sure there's, I'm curtailing myself from saying what I was just thinking, so. I'm just typing what they have in the book, folks. I'm not making it up. So, comma separated, and then of course we'll do our publish stat again. And here they're hard coding the date again. You know what? I'm just going to do date dot today, just because I'm lazy. Go ahead and close your curly brackets when you're done. Press enter. Yeah, and that happened to me too. So I have a student here that couldn't backspace. You might have to just type exit at the prompt and come back. And you got to keep in mind, as soon as you do that, you lose everything. But remember, everything we've done so far at the prompt is already saved in the database. You just have to recreate the last command. All right, now you notice after I pressed enter here that the output is just repeating back what was stored in the variable. And I'm going to pause the video here for a second just to make sure that you're okay. All right, and then you'll notice here in the book that how we write this variable now to the database is just by very simply saying article create like we did before. And then in parentheses, we're just passing the variable that we just created, which remember is a hash that creates the symbols and their values. And if you did it correctly, now you can see that it wrote it to the database, shows the database transaction. Of course, let's not take the prompt's word for it. Let's come and actually see. Now what they do in the book to actually see if it wrote to the database is they do the article.count again. So they go article.count, and of course I have 6, the book says 5, but I started with 1 extra. So it shows you that it's actually writing without actually going in there to look. But we're using the SQLite database browser tool to kind of help reassure us a little bit. And you know what? As you start out with a technology like this, it makes you more comfortable to just be able to look and see what's happening in the tables directly. So I'm a big fan of using that approach. All right, now we're moving on to doing some finding of records. And this is a pretty important little database tool as well. So this is really where we start to do, what we call the process of querying the database, right? Because if you think about, like, you create some data, and then, if your database gets huge, or your tables get huge, then you need sometimes to pull that data back. And these are going to be some of the commands that we're going to use most commonly. So notice with find, you can find, and then you can specify in the form of a symbol which column you're referring to. So in this little example here, they're pointing to the ID. But you can also put in things like find all. Guess what that one does? Or find the first, or find the last. And those are often the most common ones that we're going to see. So let's try the first command down here. So the first example is basically finding a record using an ID. So we're just going to type article, capital A, which refers to the whole class, therefore table. And then we're going to say find. And then in parentheses, they're using ID number 3. Okay. So notice what it does. It says select articles. Which articles? All articles from articles where articles.id equals whatever we typed in, right? So let's confirm that that's actually the case. So if I look at the browser here, so article 3 is Introduction to SQL, and sure enough, Introduction to SQL. And hopefully those match up for you. That's kind of nice, I think. Another thing you can do with that sort of technique is you can actually store those results into a variable. So I can do that article.find3 and store it into article. And you can see it pull the information back. And now at the prompt, if I type article.id, which is stored in memory, right? If you're thinking of it that way, you can see it pulls back the ID from that thing in memory. Why is this useful? Because there are times where we will pull the information out of the database and we will want to be able to look at it and manipulate it even without necessarily changing what's in the database. So pulling something out of the database and storing it in a variable is useful in that capacity. You also saw how it was useful in creating a new entry for the database, that you do the work first and then do the create. Because there is an inherent problem with like brute force doing the create first, straight away into the database, because you're not buffering it, and that has its own thing going on with it. So if you want to try another command, try article.title, and of course it should be, in my case, it's Introduction to SQL. The book says Intro to Active Record, but we're off by one record between the two. All right, let's do this next one. This is kind of weird, right? And we know it's going to fail. First of all, I find it strange that in this example they do article.find, but notice that there's no parentheses around that. You guys seeing that? They're just doing a space, and they're doing 1037, right? And it couldn't find that article. So what that implies is that it does not have to be inside of parentheses, or it could be, it gives you the same result. So if I did article.find and instead I typed in 6, right, without the parentheses, right, so space 6, notice it does find it. So you can put it as, a parameter inside of parentheses like you would with a regular method, or you can go space. And because it's an abstraction tool, folks, it allows you from the command line to kind of imply what you mean, and it just works. But notice the result if it's not finding it. All right, so the next little tidbit we got here is, notice like when we're not actually finding these articles in the error message that comes back, that's kind of problematic actually, because here's what happens. If you do an interaction with your database and you're not finding something, what message are you going to send to your user? That's really kind of what this next little example is about. So what they're showing here is that you might run a command like this where you do article find and you're putting in a number you know it's not going to find. And notice this keyword right here, rescue. It's kind of like error handling, folks, where it's saying if it's not finding it, the rescue is relative to the fact that the record's not found, that we're going to put a message up on the screen. And that's something like what you might actually do in an application. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy that code. Why? Because I can. Paste it in at the prompt, press enter, and sure enough, it throws back a little bit more friendly message, right? We couldn't find that record, or whatever you want to say to your user. Now, granted, the example I just used did have a hard-coded article number that we know doesn't exist, but that could just as well be a variable, right? And this could just as well be a named method. So you could include methods in your applications. In fact, most of the CRUD operations that do things like this do have little error traps put into them. But this should give you food for thought that you can also create your own, and it's not that difficult to do. And typically, we'd probably do this as a named instance of a method. It just really kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. All right, let's try the next find command, and this one we've actually kind of used before. So if we say article, capital A, dot first, so we're pulling right from the database table, it should pull back the first article in my database. Differs from what the author has because I had one pre-existing in there. And you can see all my little quippy little things that I already put in there. Of course, by much the same measure, you can put in article.last, and it should pull in, yep, the Rails pub night, right, which we're all going to race to, because I'm sure the Rails pub night is full of Packer game and Brewer game, which is what we have, like that double header going tonight. It's the top of the fourth, by the way, and the Brewers are leading 1-0, which is good.
I bet you that Rails Club night has a bunch of terrible bad
Very, very bad. Yeah, bad coding jokes.
something that your dad would get off.
So, folks, I'm tempted to go on to this next section, but we are running over in time, given the fact that I was at jury duty today, even though we extended a little bit. But this is about where we usually leave off in this chapter. So we got as much done as I hope to get done today. So the nice thing is when we come back, this example will work because we'll be taking all the articles and feeding them into a variable, which you can do. Once you see how flexible that is. So this is exactly where we're going to start next time. And I'm trying to get into the habit when I record these videos of showing the page where I left off so that when I come next week, I can at least look at the video and figure out where I left off. So I will see you guys next time, and we'll pick up right here.